It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Education Minister Gillian Keegan, Labour peer Helena Kennedy, Daily Telegraph assistant comment editor Madeline Grant and New Statesman political correspondent Alva Ray. Today, after the Weinstein verdict, is this true?
This is the new landscape for survivors of sexual assault in America, I believe, and this is a new day.
Former Liberal leader David Steele is accused of an abdication of responsibility for not acting on information that Cyril Smith had abused children. This was in the headlines in 2010.
People who live in the poorest neighbourhoods of England are likely to die 7 years younger.
So why does the report's author say things have got worse?
For deprived people in the north of the country, life expectancy was declining, particularly for women.
And does free speech need the help of this man?
The enemies of free speech hunt in packs. Its defenders need to band together too.
Let's start with the disgraced Hollywood mogul, Harvey Weinstein. He is facing up to 25 years in prison. The case of the Hollywood director has sparked the rise of the Me Too movement, but has his downfall and conviction fundamentally changed society, Gillian?
I think it has the opportunity to. It's certainly a very high-profile case. And, you know, it's clear that the way, the benchmark of how we hold ourselves, you know, the accountability in terms of standards has massively shifted over 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But now the accountability in this case, at one point it looked like he might be able to sort of get off, and actually the fact that they have, you know, very much focused on two cases and they've found him guilty. I mean, obviously the relief for survivors is going to be massive, but I think it has. Seeing somebody so high profile, you know, on his way to, well, I don't know, he made it to hospital, I think, instead of Riker Island. But, you know, that I'm sure that's had a massive impact, yeah.
Do you think it has fundamentally changed something?
Well, the whole Me Too thing has, but you know, I've written extensively on this. It has built up over years. Remember, we've had the Savile inquiry and that whole business of that scandal. We've had the whole business of Rochester. There's been a build-up in our societies of women gaining the confidence to actually speak out, and actually then, in turn, being listened to. And for too many years, they were just not listened to. And that's been the complaint of many, many women the world over, that their legal systems have basically not listened to them, because women as credible witnesses have not been valued, and also because our judiciary and our legal systems were essentially created by men from their perspective, and so often women felt they were failed because the systems were not made with women in mind.
We still do have some failure in those systems, right? If you look at the actual rates now of prosecution and rape prosecution, so, you know, I think there's a change, but there's still a long way to go.
Do you agree?
I think that it's been a huge vindication for the Me Too movement, because this was, in many ways, an extremely cynical trial. Harvey Weinstein's team were using every dirty trick in the book. He was even spotted, I think the thing that particularly infuriated me was his use of this falling apart Zimmer frame that had these tennis balls on the end. This man is a multi-millionaire. We're really supposed to believe that he couldn't afford a better Zimmer frame, and there's since been footage of him leaving the courtroom without the assistance of the Zimmer frame. It was a cynical plot designed to create a false sense of victimhood. And at the same time, the relief for the victims must be enormous, because you have the pressure of not just the trauma of having to go through one of these trials, but also the fact that you're aware that the future of the Me Too movement and the public opinion of that movement very much rests on the outcome of this case.
Alva?
I mean, I agree with all of you that this is a really momentous moment in feminism, basically, and picking up on what Helena was saying, I think being from a younger generation of women, we haven't really grown up with that sense that if men don't respect your personal space or sort of objectify you in the workplace, that we should put up with that. We've learnt from an older generation, like around ideas of consent and so on. We've had consent education at universities. So I think that this is a really important moment for us when we have this sense that this is stuff we shouldn't put up with. I think our experience has often been that we're let down by the legal system. So this is a really important moment to see that actually, even though it took 90 women to come forward and only 2 convictions to actually happen, I think this is a really momentous move in the right direction.
So I would say, I think that it's... I'm not sure that there are obviously monsters like Harvey Weinstein, far too many of them throughout society, but I'm not sure if this can necessarily be kind of extrapolated to take conclusions across society. Most men are not like Harvey Weinstein. Most men are not potential rapists. And I think actually I fundamentally disagree with the consent workshop attitude, which seeks to portray men as kind of already suspicious before anything has happened, encouraging women to view men with suspicion.
No, it's not, the consent workshops are not about that. I was the head of a college and I dealt with this stuff. It's about basically that when people are involved in intimacy, always checking, is this okay? And men should be doing it and women should be doing it.
What if they don't want to do it? I mean, maybe that's the stilted way of engaging in sexual relations.
You have to want to respect consent. I think that this is the momentous thing about this. That, I mean, we know that it's really hard to prosecute these cases because it's so often one person's word against another. So what we really, really want is that culture change. Basically, we want people to understand that even if we've had this like very archaic idea that women, in some sort of sense, owe men sex, or all these tricky ideas around patriarchal ideals, that we have to move away from that, and that men need to respect women's agency in sexual and so it's not about viewing men with suspicion. It's about it's teaching men new ideas around consent
and mutuality.
That is a fairly, I mean, you're sort of, you have to bring people with you. You can't force people into it. And all of this is creating a culture of suspicion around sex. And we know that young people are having less sex as it is. I'm not sure that micromanaging it further by some university burster is the way to do it.
I've noticed.
I mean, on the question actually brought up by Alva, coming from a younger generation, Helena, this idea that Harvey Weinstein, most powerful man in Hollywood, brought down, he abused his position, that was clear in the cases he's been convicted of. But on a day-to-day basis, are we saying that power play, those power structures have changed? Are we in a situation that won't happen anymore?
Well, of course, they're going to continue to happen as long as there's power disparity. And I'm a lawyer who's spent my life writing and working on this stuff. And all I can tell you is that it's that business of there being power being vested. It's usually in the hands of men and senior men, and how they can abuse that. And so as we see women going into positions of power, as we see an evenness in society about what the opportunities are for men and women, as men play their role in different ways with their own families and children, and think about how their daughters might feel, it does change things.
Right, what about empowering victims to come forward? Do you think this will help more victims of abuse to come forward?
Yes, I think it will help. And I think the whole campaign has actually helped. I mean, this is the point Helena made about being listened to. And that is the most important. Being believed and being listened to, because as Alva says, it is usually, there's not really much evidence. It's one word against another, whether it's consensual or not, is often the case, and that was indeed his defence. I think, going back to your point about has it changed the power structures, it hasn't probably changed the power structures. What it's changed, though, is an understanding of the accountability, and that actually the chance of you getting away with it now as probably was much easier in 20, 30 years ago, certainly in my working lifetime, and I'm very glad that it's changed for you. But it's definitely, anybody sat there thinking they can get away with it will look at that and think, there's no way I can get away with this.
Yeah, a lot of men are, particularly we're talking about men who are in positions of power where they can abuse it. They're going to think twice, I hope.
Right, and we will discuss this balance between being believed as a victim and whether all victims, or people who say they are victims, should be believed, the balance between what the
that's always difficult
victim is saying and the accused. I mean, this is what drove, in part, the independent inquiry into child sex abuse, which is reporting today, chaired by Alexis Jay. And it was set up because of concerns that some organisations in England and Wales had failed to protect children from sexual abuse. And it was set up by Theresa May in the wake you mentioned of the Jimmy Savile sexual abuse scandal. Let's talk to Tom Simons, who's at the inquiry, our Home Affairs correspondent. Tom, remind us of the scope of this huge inquiry and the difficulties it experienced at the start.
Well, incredibly wide, Joe. Everything from politics, which we're discussing today, but also children's homes, children overseas. Really, it's a never-ending inquiry, it seems, though it will end at the end of this year. But as you said, it came out of the Savile scandal and something else. The claims by Tom Watson, the then Labour MP, that there was a paedophile network, powerful paedophile network, linked to Number 10. Pretty big claim, and this inquiry says it has found no evidence to suggest that that was true. But it does say that there were individual cases of people of prominence who were thought to be involved in child abuse, and that when that came to light, those claims were not properly dealt with by politics, by police and by prosecutors. And the inquiry concludes that deference by police and prosecutors and political parties towards politicians and others was the result, that there were differences in treatment according to how wealthy or well-connected people were, and that there was a failure by almost every institution to put the needs of children first. So it's a pretty damning report.
Yes, and Tom, what about the case of the late MP Cyril Smith and the former leader David Steele in terms of why he didn't act on information given to him about Cyril Smith?
Well, that's one of two cases I will pick out. Now, Cyril Smith was investigated by police as early as 1969 about allegations that he was abusing children in Rochdale, in two schools in Rochdale. David Steele was then the leader of the Liberal Party, the forerunner of the Liberal Democrats, in 1979, when he had a conversation with Cyril Smith about all of this, and Smith effectively told him that he had been investigated by police, and David Steele told this inquiry that he regarded that as a true allegation, but he said he didn't do anything about it, and the inquiry criticises him quite strongly today, saying that that was an abdication of his responsibility. The other case I would pick out involves the Conservatives. Sir Peter Morrison, who became permanent private secretary to Margaret Thatcher. It came to light that there were concerns about him. Margaret Thatcher was told something about those concerns, but again, not very much was done, and Sir Peter Morrison was eventually knighted. So two out of a great number of cases considered by this inquiry.
Tom Simons, thank you very much. Apologies for some of the sound difficulties there, but we got most of it. That was great. Let's talk about Cyril Smith and what should happen to David Steele, because he was suspended by the Liberal Democrat Party last year when he gave evidence to the inquiry, and he said he had thought the allegations were true, but he didn't act on them because it was preceding his time as a member of the Liberal Democrat Party and as a Lib Dem MP. Now, he has been blamed for an abdication of responsibility by this inquiry. The Liberal Democrats have put out a very short statement, but that's referring to Cyril Smith. What do you think should be the action, if any, against David Steele?
Well, let me first of all say that one of the things that is always at the basis of this stuff is that people put their reputation of their political party, their institution, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, they put reputation ahead of the interests and well-being of the individuals who've been abused, whether they're mentally ill people, whether they're children, whether they're young women, whoever. And they put reputation ahead, and that's one of the problems. And I suspect that whether it was Mrs. Thatcher or whether it was David Steele, there was a sort of sense which was, oh, this is going to be absolutely horrifying for the party. If we can close it all down and keep it quiet, that's the best way out of it. And I'm afraid it was very much, and until comparatively recently, it's been the way of doing things. Oxford colleges, everywhere. And so all I'm saying is that, here we had David Steele. Presumably, he at least was straightforward and honest in saying, I was told stuff, which made me think that he was guilty of this kind of behaviour, but I didn't take steps. So he's fessed up to his own failure. The Liberal Party has got some, backstory on some of this kind of behaviour, as indeed has every political party. None of them have clean hands on this. And so all I would say is that the Liberal Party may have to consider whether they have to take a stand and take a position with regard to David Steele, who I happen to think is a rather decent man.
Madeleine?
I think, yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I think there are many similarities with the Jimmy Savile case. But in both cases, the perpetrator has died long before the true scale of his crimes has become known, so there's an absence of justice. There's also, in both cases, a kind of affable exterior that people sort of bought into and were willing to overlook and believe. And most importantly, both cases involved men who were using preying on the most vulnerable people. In Cyril Smith's case, it was children who were staying in a hostel in his constituency. And he was able to essentially determine which children were staying in that hospital and having direct access to them so he could meet his favourites. I mean, it's a truly horrifying incident. And it just shows exactly that deference to authority and willingness to trust in surface level affability is, it can conceal something so enormous in scope for so many decades.
Well, and a bit like the Weinstein case, has anything changed? I mean, has society changed enough then that these people won't be protected, hiding in plain sight?
Well, we've had more recent cases, right? In the case of Rotherham, in case of grooming, it's the same thing. It's vulnerable, children being targeted. And, obviously being abused. So has it changed? What's changed is we're much more alert to looking for those cases. And I think now, certainly local councils and all the people who would be involved in trying to safeguard vulnerable children would be much more alert. But still, it's been so widespread. I mean, just as Helena said, all the church and football, it's been, I mean, pretty much every part of society. It's almost astonishing, really.
In the case of Rotherham and Oldham and other places, it's been a sense of political correctness that has led to things being ignored because people didn't want to be seen to be offending cultural sensibilities.
Hold on a minute. That's the easy way of writing that off. I've spent my life in the courts, and I can tell you that white men have just been as guilty of pass-around girls and abusing young white women.
The police were reluctant to go and pursue these cases on the basis that quotas, and they didn't want to be seen to be
the police felt that these were unworthy girls. That's at the heart of all of this, and that there are some people deserving of protection.
Both can be true at once.
Yeah, and some people being worthy of protection, and others were not. They were dealing with them as if they were trashy girls. That was what was despicable about it.
To look at it slightly differently, the case of Tom Watson, who stood up in the House of Commons, the former deputy leader of the Labour Party, and talked about the allegations that had been brought about a VIP paedophile ring in Westminster. The person who came forward with those allegations, known as Nick, was found to be a serial liar. Are there questions to answer about that position that Tom Watson took?
I think probably actually most people would agree with me that Tom Watson acted in entirely good faith in that case. I mean, we want our politicians to instinctively believe the abused and the vulnerable and to take their side and champion them when they often feel, as you were saying, it's the people who feel like they don't have a voice, who are treated as trashy, as unworthy, who aren't believed. I think that, I mean, it's obviously a really, really terrible case, but how was Tom Watson to know that this person was a serial liar?
But should he have been so adamant in the way that he did stand up on these allegations? I'll come to Madeline first, and then I'll come back to you, Helene.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. There was certainly an element of that, for sure.
Right, and in terms of the victim, when you look at someone like Nick coming forward, how much should people be believed on the basis of coming forward with allegations?
Well, I think that there was a sense that because of the Savile case, that the police therefore needed to take everything incredibly seriously. So there was a sense of heightened sensibilities around the time that these allegations emerged. And I think it's very important that people don't proceed further with things until they have credible evidence, because that's how you end up with Field Marshal Lord Bramall, whose wife was very, stricken with dementia, and they invaded his house in the early hours of the morning and carted him off, basically. Imagine the trauma involved in that. You have to be so careful before you take those steps.
And Tom Watson did use parliamentary privilege, didn't he, to make case before the evidence had been found?
I just wish more politicians really understood what the rule of law means, and that, in fact, there has to be due process. And the interesting thing is that for many years, the police just didn't believe, the scepticism was folk make these things up.
Yeah.
And so the starting point was disbelief.
Yes.
And then they're told, listen, you can't do that. Look at what's happened with all these different cases that historically have come forward. And then they swing in the exact opposite direction.
Yes.
And that's the thing is that you have to always be listening and wanting to hear what people are saying, but also know that in amongst the many who are telling the truth, there will be the occasion when somebody is lying. And that can put lives at risk.
How dangerous is that balance if you don't get it right?
Well, of course, that's the to-do, right? That's the difficult part of the justice system, particularly where evidence is based on what people say. But I think in the case of this particular person, Nick, it didn't take very much to show that there was holes in his story. And it did come out very quickly afterwards that actually if they'd have triangulated a couple of bits of information, they may have had a bigger question mark right at the beginning. And I don't know. I mean, I'm always suspicious when politics are involved that it does give another driver, right? It was before my time in Parliament. I mean, I like Tom Watson very much, but we've just been talking about David Steele and about that reaction. I think if it's your party, the reaction's probably different if it's a different political party, and that is an element there. Right. But this guy was non-credible, and it didn't take long, actually, when it was investigated to show that he wasn't. His story didn't add up. It was fantasist.
All right,
so that must be easier to distinguish from somebody who's got a credible story, at least.
We're going to move on. We're going to move on because we're going to talk about a new report which has been published today, warning of worsening health inequalities in England. Let's show you the front page of the Manchester Evening News. This is a report by Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who says that life expectancy growth has stalled over the past decade for the first time in 100 years. For women in the poorest communities in England, it actually declined between 2010 and 2012 and 2016 and 18. The headline says the North-South divide is getting even wider. Gillian, life expectancy in parts of the UK has declined over the last decade. On your watch, quite simply, some people are dying younger. I mean, there couldn't be a worse indictment of your government and previous Tory government's record.
I think I'm a woman from the north, right? So I'm from an area that is probably very much part of this report, from Knowsley and Merseyside. So, my parents live there, my grandmothers, my aunts, uncles, my best friend, everybody. I am fully aware that there is massive health inequality.
And it happened on your watch?
I mean, it's been there since ever I've been alive, as far as I can see.
We've seen a drop, though.
We have seen a drop, and in these figures it has dropped by a couple of months for older women, but the serious point is there is massive inequality, and we know there's massive inequality. I left Knowsley when I was 25. I know, I grew up there. There's massive inequality. So that's why the whole government agenda is really focused on more money in the NHS. We had more money yesterday. We voted through. Well, we didn't vote in the end. It just went through for more increased council spending. Obviously, I've just taken on the skills and apprenticeship brief in the Department of Education. There's a huge focus on FE.
Sure.
Reform.
But you can't get away from
poverty.
the conclusions of this report that have said over the last 10 years, Michael Marmot says, put simply, health has stopped improving. And if it has stopped improving since 2010, it's a sign that society has stopped improving.
To some degree, but we know that, what have we got? We've got a housing crisis. We know that because we've got more people who want houses than we've got houses, so we need to fix that. We know that we're trying to obviously focus on employment. More people have employment. Now the quality of employment is being focused on. More people are now earning more people are keeping hold of their own money. Of course, this is never ending in a way. You are always going to have to really try to address these inbuilt inequalities. I went to a comprehensive school in Knowsley. I've been back to many funerals of people I went to school with as a result of their life opportunities just not working out.
Right, but not working, Jonathan Ashworth says, the Shadow Health Secretary, in his tweet, a devastating verdict on 10 years of Tory cuts. He obviously is linking it directly to austerity, life expectancy flatten and decline for poorest 10% of women, health inequalities widening and health deteriorates, north-south health gap increased. Austerity caused
But I always get a little bit, and this is not me being over political. OK, I'm a politician, but...
And a minister.
And a minister, but... there is no, there are many complex reasons why, and having. Of course, you can point to, if we hadn't had a note saying there's no money left and we could have spent money, would it have changed? I don't know, but but it's too simple actually, and it's not really. It's a much bigger problem, and we've got to have a much wider agenda of investment in the north, including skills, infrastructure, all the things we're talking about: hospitals, GPs, GP appointments, better cancer outcomes. There's a whole range of things, plus prevention and public health. I would agree, does need to be better.
Listening to Gillian saying it's complicated.
I mean, it's complicated, but the verdict is straightforward. I mean, this is a damning indictment of the record of two successive Tory governments, and we're now in a third. And there's a fundamental absurdity that under Boris Johnson, he can promise, spending splurges and reforms for the NHS and so on, basically just reversing the cuts that other Tory governments brought in. But I think the point, on the point that it's complicated, I would agree with Gillian that it's complicated in that there are multiple facets running through this report, which I took the time to read this morning. But it's basically all down to austerity, every single one. In different ways, like the conclusions of the report on every single level.
That makes it less credible than it should be then.
Then on every single level, they're just calling for increased investment in one area, increased investment in another. It's utterly damning. And the thing I would really like to highlight, if I may, is the sense that some of these measures that have seen this absolutely shocking decline in health expectancy and life expectancy is that these ideas were ideologically driven rather than research driven, in that the research was very clear, for example, on the idea of sanctions for people who are out of work, sanctions in terms of people on job seekers allowance. The evidence was very clear in 2013 that the people weren't being encouraged into work by tougher sanctions. Those tougher sanctions came in. It was absolutely damning, the things coming out. The people who couldn't go into work were people who were disabled or over 50. At the time, Esther McVeigh defended it, and the whole thing...
We've had 1,000 new jobs a day, right? People going into jobs, 1,000 people
it's very, very clear. It says research has shown the majority of job seekers are keen to work and do not require the threat of sanction. Instead, sanctions cause further poverty and in some cases destitution. The evidence was there nearly a decade ago, and we've seen the impact of it. And it's all because it was ideological rather than research driven.
So it is down to austerity and ideologically driven?
I haven't seen evidence for that, for the reason.
But the evidence is in the report.
The report is also ideological. I mean, Mr. Marmot,
it's a report by the University of York.
He is of the left, and he does this every year. There is a lot of editorialising.
He did it 10 years
every
ago.
10 years. Sorry, but this also has to be viewed in the context of a general slowing down of life expectancy that's taking place across the developed world.
Why is it reversing?
It hasn't reversed. It has simply grown at a slightly less fast rate than in previous years.
Well, it says it actually declined.
No, it hasn't.
For women in the poorest communities.
In some areas, and there are obviously big regional disparities, but there are big regional disparities in health and fitness, and that might not necessarily be linked to austerity. That's a case of correlation, not causation.
I think
and it's also problematic.
Causation,
please let me finish. It's also problematic that he uses the figure of public spending as a percentage of GDP from 2010 onwards, when in 2010 GDP was abnormally low after the financial crash, and spending was abnormally high because we were bailing out the banks. So you're not comparing. That's not a normal year to compare practice this year with.
All right.
I think there are lots of methodological.
All right, but there is also some broader context, following on from what you've all said, Helena, because actually this report was done after 12 years of a Labour government. It was done in 2010, and the point was made then in Michael Marmot's report that health inequalities were starting or had already become entrenched. So it's not new, is it?
It's not new, but it's got hugely worse. And one of the things
Has it got hugely worse?
Well, first of all, I want to just say that I'm shocked at you, Madeleine, because to play the man and to attack him as being somebody of the left is really quite wrong. He's been very critical of Labour governments too. He's a man who's an expert, and this is a classic thing of the right, is to attack people with expertise. This is a man whose expertise is in poverty.
That's a bit of a cheap shot as well.
And I'm sorry, it is.
But on the substance,
there is a great deal of editorialising. There is an assumption that there is an assumption.
Don't talk over each other. Let Helena finish, and then I'll come back to you.
Time, Madeleine. All right, let me just deal with this. This is a man whose expertise is in looking at poverty and looking at the ways in which our social structures are either improving or not improving. He's been critical in the past of Labour and Labour's failure, for example,
what about that?
And so on. And that was there. Right, but the starting point was that you then see a huge acceleration down the slope because of the austerity policies, and those policies were wicked. And so don't try and shy away from that. They were deeply, they were ideological, because the whole idea was to shrink welfare, to shrink the state, and that was the ideological position of the Conservatives in government.
All right, let Madeleine respond.
I think there is a serious case of correlation, or at least there is a possibility of correlation, not causation, taking place here, because this slowdown in life life expectancy growth. It has still been rising overall. Has also been observed in countries that have not experienced obvious austerity at all. Female life expectancy overall is down in a country like Iceland that spends a great deal more as a percentage of GDP. It's also similar levels of decline have been seen in Sweden. So I'm not sure that it's possible to extrapolate from this that austerity is necessarily at the heart of it. That's a political point.
It's not possible to actually extract from the report and say, here is the reason. That actually almost makes it a bit
Well, it may be difficult to establish the cause and effect, but it is clear what Marmot has said on health.
To say that there is a need to further invest in these areas to reduce inequality is absolutely right. It's been right since I've been alive. It still is right, and it will be right probably till long after I'm dead. It will always. We have to put more investment. We have to provide these routes out of poverty. It's very complex. There'll be many different things. Skills and education is a massive area. We know that. Retraining, access to being able to pick up somebody when they're ready to be able to get on the work ladder. Offering these opportunity and helping handhold people to escape poverty is the fundamental thing, which is the biggest driver.
And it's very heartening
of
to hear you
equality.
saying all of that. Let me immediately say it's very heartening to hear you saying all of that. But the thing that happened after the economic crisis, and then the Conservatives came into government, first in coalition and then on their own. And the thing was that the people who paid the price were the poorest in our society. And that is really something that they will tell you. They're watching the programme. They will tell you that.
No, I know.
But is it always about money? Is it always about the money? Because
it's about opportunity, it's about education, it's about housing, the absence of housing, it's about all those things.
But they've all got different drivers. Housing is because there's more people. There's more people and there's not enough houses. Actually, the housing crisis in some of the areas, up north, for example, is a little less because actually it's more affordable now. It's more affordable because the wages versus the, if you've got two people buying a house, actually it's much more affordable. We sold my nan's council house for 57 grand that she bought 2 years ago. You can. So this is more complex. It is more difficult. Housing is a huge problem. It's a huge problem in London.
Alpha, I'm just going to give the final.
Inequality decreased after the financial crisis because of the decline in middle incomes and wealthy people losing so much money. Inequality was never lower than right after the financial crisis.
Right, but on that, if you look back though, pre the crash, was money always the solution? Because after years of the economy booming to some extent under Tony Blair, there were still these health inequalities. The SNP actually said that life expectancy in Glasgow East was lower than the Gaza Strip, they said, in 2008. So it wasn't just about money and public spending.
Well, it's about very entrenched class differences, and I think that in some ways it does boil down to money, where when you go through this very, very long report, as Gillian says, there are areas around housing, around education, around early years training, but so much of it comes down to the need for investment in those early years. And I think on the earlier point about how there are external factors and pressures on our society in various ways, but I mean, this is still a story of an utter failure to deal with those external factors. And so I think, whether it isn't perfectly correlated with austerity or not, I think this is an absolute story of failure or a successful Tory government.
We have a huge opportunity now, and I honestly feel this, particularly with the way our representation is across the country. We have a real opportunity.
All right, Gillian, we're going to leave it there because we're going to talk about Brexit, and we're going to catch up with Adam Fleming in Brussels. Hi, Adam. EU foreign ministers are meeting today to agree their negotiating mandate for the future relationship with the UK. The UK is going to publish theirs on Thursday, I understand. How far apart are the two sides?
Well, the ministers have met and they have adopted this mandate, this 46-page document. And you don't have to be an expert in all of this stuff, although we all are now, to realise where the potential flashpoints are going to be. And they're quite big ones. So the infamous level playing field, where the EU says there has to be constraints on economic competition, and you deliver that by having the UK committing to upholding common shared standards in 7 policy areas, which are competition, state-owned companies, social and employment law, environmental law, which now includes food safety as well, #chlorinated chicken, climate change, international tax principles and state aid. What they've done as they've been tweaking this mandate over the last few weeks is try to make the language around that look a bit more relaxed and make it not look like the idea of dynamic alignment of the UK having to follow EU rules in perpetuity. They have tried. I'm not sure they've succeeded in making it not look like dynamic alignment. I think to British eyes, a lot of this will look like the opposite of what they're trying to achieve. The other flashpoint, I think, is going to be fisheries, as we've talked about before. This mandate has also been tweaked by diplomats to constantly use the word uphold in all the bits where it talks about fisheries. In other words, uphold current EU access to British fishing waters. And I think the other big area of contention is going to be in the governance. Sorry to use that jargon again, but how do you manage the relationship? And is there a role at all for the European Court of Justice to settle disputes where there's something to do with EU law? The UK says it doesn't want the words European Court of Justice to appear anywhere in the deal. The EU says it does.
Right. Well, on that great start, we will catch up with you again later in the week. Adam, thank you very much there from Brussels, marking our cards on the negotiations to come. We're going to talk about free speech. I'm going to invite in Inaya Folarin-Inan, who is the director of something called the Free Speech Union. It is relatively new. Let me just show you the story in The Times yesterday. It has Free Speech Union fights Twitter witch hunts, with its General Secretary Toby Young there in the picture. Inaya, thank you for coming in. Why do we need a free speech union? What's the problem you're trying to solve?
I think first and foremost, it's really important to remember that free speech is a fundamental right for all people. It is the fundamental bedrock of our society, and without free speech, we are not able to explore new ideas, to challenge each other and to understand each other. And what we have seen, particularly in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, is a kind of permissive acceptance of a kind of culture that increasingly creates boundaries for people to discuss quite contentious ideas. And we've seen it in the universities. Many people thought originally it was kind of zealous students, but we've seen it far more than that in academia, in policing, in the media, and it is increasingly stifling our ability to have conversations about really important issues. And this is an organisation that really wants to fight back against that. The Free Speech Union is a mass membership, non-partisan organisation which will be defending people who are at risk of basically having their free speech stifled.
Have you got any examples specifically that you can give us where people might need the Free Speech Union to defend them?
Well, for example, a prominent feminist academic, Kathleen Stock, at the moment is having to have security guards to be able to do her job at universities. We've even seen, for example, this recent kind of really blown up case about Lawrence Fox and some of the things that he said. And in the last 48 hours, he said that now he is coming off social media due to the fact that he's been consistently mobbed. That is totally unacceptable. And there's a range of things that we will do. For example, on the kind of smaller end, if somebody is being mobbed on social media, which actually has quite significant psychological effects, we will come to their defence. That's really significant because just having the support there, knowing that you're not alone, can actually really be positive for people. But on the other end, we can look at kind of Harry Miller, who was recorded as having a non-crime hate incident and took police to court and won. And so we will help him potentially crowdfund for his legal fees, put people in touch with lawyers that may be able to help them. So there's a range of things that can be done.
Are you going to join up this union, Helena?
I'm not going to join up this union because I think that it's there already. I believe in freedom of speech. It's a fundamental right. It's fundamental to democracy. And I am unhappy with the way in which social networks allow for abuse in ways that I think is horrifying. However, I do think that some of the people that will join your organisation will be racists who will be really wanting to use this as a cover in order to be abusive in racist ways. You will also have people... Sorry, let me finish. Yeah. You will also have people who hate homosexuals, who hate trans people. You will also have lots of people who will come on who have hostile views towards Islam. So I suspect that you will get an awful lot of very ugly views being expressed. And while I think there should be freedom of speech, it doesn't mean freedom to be abusive. And that's the difference.
OK, so none of us have ever said that it's freedom to be abusive. And I absolutely would recommend people to be responsible on social media. But this is the kind of danger that we have, is any time we have a conversation about something so fundamental like free speech, it's constantly framed in relation to hate. And that kind of distorts the kind of narrative around it when it's actually so crucial and so important. And it's not just racists and fascists that are being targeted. As I've just given examples, Kathleen Stock, Peter Tatchell, a gay rights campaigner, has been replatformed.
Women who are sceptical of gender fluidity, routinely labelled TERFs. A tutor at my old Oxford College, Selina Todd, now has to attend lectures with 2 bodyguards accompanying her. You know, it goes both ways. But the problem with cancel culture is that it very often it's often very much driven by the left, and it applies unequally to people who are on the right, expressing what are often quite anodyne views and are still being hounded out of public life as a result.
OK, but what about the case of Andrew Sabisky, the number 10 advisor who left or was asked to leave? There's a picture of him there after some historic social media posts resurfaced. I mean, I can read a couple of them. It was suggested that compulsory contraception could be used to stop a permanent underclass. Women's sport is more comparable to the Paralympics than it is to men's. The mean black American IQ, I slightly paraphrase, based on a century's worth of data, is lower than a mean white American IQ. Is that defensible?
So, first and foremost, obviously, we'll have to look at all of these things from a case-by-case basis. But I think that this particular issue about Sabisky is more complicated than just labelling it as a free speech issue. For example, there's legitimate arguments to be had about whether the government did their due diligence and kind of the vetting process.
Would you have let him join? Hang on. Would you have let him join the union?
Well, so once he was hired, we don't necessarily think that he should just be kind of hung out to dry and completely ostracised and vilified off social media. We have no idea what's happened to that person.
Do you mind if I just
so for
ask
example,
you?
one second. So I think that for an individual like Sabisky, we would be calling for there to be some kind of, due process instead of just hanging that person out to dry. That has really chilling consequences.
Hold on a minute. Well, I'm just going to let Alva come in, and then I'll come to you. Go on.
So I'm just curious. So you were saying, I'm curious about how this will work in practice. So the idea is you've cited these examples of people who are targeted by Twitter mobs and so on for
Not
certain.
just Twitter mobs. I've also talked about Harry
So
Miller.
for example,
well, hang on. Let Alva finish.
So for example,
it has consequences.
Hang on, because no one can hear. Let Alva make her point.
Exercise my right to free speech. As you were saying, basically, when someone is targeted by a mob of some sort, or when they come under attack for expressing certain views, the Free Speech Union promises to mobilise an army to defend them. I'm curious as to what that means and what good it will do.
So if we look at, for example, Alistair Stewart, who resigned because of something that he said on social media, what we actually saw was many journalists, many people and his friends coming out in support of him, and that actually, did a lot of positive things for his character and reputation. Actually, what we find on social media, it becomes all-consuming, and so someone's reputation is dragged through the mud, and people are scared to defend them. It ends up being self-censorship.
So actually, an organisation...
I'm answering your question. So actually, having an organisation full of many significant and prominent people coming out in support of you...
All right, but let Alva respond.
And is this just a sort of way to get Toby Young onto the Today programme and onto various programmes to defend people who've said controversial opinions online?
Toby Young isn't here. I'm here speaking.
But is that the sort of plan? I don't really understand how this will improve people's right to free speech if really, when there's an angry Twitter mob that's all incensed about certain views, you're going to mobilise another one.
I've just given you an example, but Toby Young is not the only person in that organisation.
I'm not really trying to understand.
But is there a line? Is there a limit to free speech?
Let's just look. Free speech is fundamental because it is out of discourse and debate that we develop our ideas as a society going forward. But we also have to treat each other with respect, and the way in which debates are being conducted now is often disrespectful. Now, the point about, for example, the guy who was employed in Downing Street saying all these rather offensive things is that, of course, he should be entitled to say it, but not as somebody who's in a prominent position in Downing Street and associated with our leadership of this country. That's what's wrong. Toby Young complained in the newspaper article that he wrote on Sunday, saying that we have to set up this new organisation. He was unable to take up a position in the regulatory educational regulatory authority that was being created, because complaints were made about things that he'd put on his Twitter account. The things he put on his Twitter account were disgusting, and they were offensive, and not only offensive because sometimes views will offend people, but he actually degraded and humiliated a woman, suggesting sexual things about her. Padma Lakshmi was humiliated by what he did, and he did not deserve to have a public
In the final few seconds, Anaya?
At the end of the day, Toby has founded many free schools. He has significant educational experience. Just some tweets that he actually apologised for and deleted mean he should be completely excluded from public life. This is the example that we're saying. It's unforgivable. It's unforgivable.
I think this conversation is going to continue while we go off air, but from all of us here, bye-bye.